Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. Don't go camping in Oklahoma. Alright, now this is a story I haven't told in a long time. It happened to me October, 6 years ago. I've told 4 or 5 people since then, and none of them believed me. I decided to stop talking about it when someone filed an anonymous tip to my school psychologist. That was 4 years ago. I've had a lot of time to think about it since then, and I think I'm finally ready to post my story somewhere. It's about a weekend I spent in the Ouachita National Forest. I had been planning the trip for weeks. Made sure I had the weekend off work. Didn't make any plans. All of that. Started buying supplies a week before I went. I was gonna go camping in the forest near my town. I had been camping before, when I was a little kid with my parents. But never as an adult, never by myself, and never in this forest. I was so excited. Now, I'm not an idiot. I took all the necessary precautions. I told a few of my friends where I was going, when I was going to be there, and when I'll be back. I told them if I go missing to call the cops and all that. I brought an extra phone battery and enough food and water to last me a fucking week. I even brought along the 9mm that my dad gave me when I turned 18. Never shot the damn thing, but I figured it would at least scare off whatever the hell wanted to mess with me. I'm telling you all of this so you know that I'm not just some dumb kid who decided he wanted to take a trip to the forest one day and shit his pants 'cause he saw a bear. No, I knew what I was getting into. I was prepared. Just not for, well, this. Okay, enough backstory. I'll get on with it. I left around 6 in the morning. It's an hour drive from my place, so I was expecting to get there around 7. Ended getting there at 7:30, but I didn't mind. It was a lovely day, not a cloud in the sky, great weather. Camping in the cold and rain is miserable, so I was pretty content with my arrival time. I parked my car a ways away from the forest in a little clearing off the side of the road where I knew I would find it. I gathered my things, had a little snack, and headed off toward the forest. The next few hours are kinda boring, so I'll skip over them. All you need to know is that I made my way well into the forest, set up a camp, and started enjoying myself. Cooked myself lunch on the crummy campfire I made around noon. Watched a pair of birds dancing at each other. I even took a few pictures of some deer I saw with my phone. Couldn't get a good shot, but it's at least proof I was there. But something seemed off. You see, forests are normally kinda loud. Not like a city loud, but there's this constant background noise that is always going on. Rustling in bushes and leaves, birds chirping, and animals prancing around. When I first got into the forest, that was all well and good. But the later it got, the sounds just started to go away. Not all at once, it took the better part of the day for me to notice. But yeah, the sound slowly went away. Birds stopped chirping. Bushes stopped rustling. I stopped seeing animals too. That's what made me notice. At around 4 in the afternoon, I realized that I hadn't seen a bird in a while. That unsettled me, truth be told. But I steeled myself and kept enjoying this day. I was feeling kind of lonely, what with the quiet and all, so I called up a friend and chatted with him till sundown. After that, I realized it was getting late, so I hung up, ate again, and put out the fire. After a final assessment of my surroundings, a look at the wondrous night sky, I crawled into my tent to sleep. I kept the 9mm loaded right next to where I slept. Just in case, you know? Sleeping on the cold ground in the middle of a forest isn't that easy if you aren't used to it, and considering I hadn't done it since I was a child, I was having a little trouble. It was probably, just a rough estimate, 2 hours after I had lied down that I started hearing something in nature again. Now, if I had heard bushes rustling a few hours earlier, this would have been cause for celebration. But even Bear Grylls would get creeped out if it was the only thing he'd heard all night. So I did what any rational human would have done and clung to 9mm like it was the only thing keeping me from falling off a cliff. There was silence for a few minutes. The only thing I could hear was my own shaky breath. Then, prancing. Ba-da-da-dum. 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 For footsteps in quick succession. No crunching of leaves or snapping of twigs. Just the steady beat. Ba-da-da-dum. 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 It was getting louder, closer to my tent. I tried to peer through the fabric that separated me from nature, but I couldn't make out a silhouette. I clutched the rifle harder, scared as any person would be. I remember being sure that I would be safe, though. Even bears will rarely attack camps unprovoked. But that natural human fear, that was overbearing, making my mind wander and my hands shake. Ba-da-da-dum. Ba-da-da-dum. Ba-da-da. It stopped, close to my tent, just outside of my tent. I could feel its presence near me. It was totally silent. I knew that it couldn't have been a bear. It would be sniffing the tent right now if it were. I doubted that it was a deer. They don't come out at night. Perhaps a wolf? They normally travel in packs, and even if it were a lone wolf, it wouldn't be a threat until I heard growling. But nothing. Just silence. And then it screeched. That's when I knew that that thing wasn't anything I'd seen before. Nothing makes that sort of sound. It was like a cross between some sort of bird and a human. Like the shit you hear in movies that possessed people with their heads on backwards make. That's when I let fear take over, in my bladder and in my hands. I fired the gun in its direction, and dear God, was that a mistake. It screeched again, and it scratched the tent, tearing through the fabric, leaving a massive gash in the side. That was my first look at it, if you could call it a look. I barely saw a silhouette through the hole in my tent, but I did see its long arms shredding the side of the tent. It was trying to get to me. I fired the rifle again, but I must have missed, because it didn't flinch. That was when the flight reflex took over the fight, and I only wanted to do one thing: run. I turned around and fiddled with the opening of the tent, trying to keep my eye on the beast attacking me, but also trying to secure my escape as fast as I could. I did it, and dove out of the tent, breaking into a full sprint. Behind me, I heard the thing still tearing into my tent. I thought that maybe it mistook its enemy or prey for the tent and not me. But that relief didn't last long. I wasn't far from the tent when I heard its rhythmic prancing again. Asterisk ba-da-da-dum. 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 Asterisk FFF. It was faster than me, gaining on me. If I tried to outrun it, I would surely be caught. Just then, in what was either a moment of survivalist brilliance or suicidal stupidity, I stopped and dove into a thick bush near me. I remembered that many predators in the forest rely on seeing movement more than anything else. So if I could stay still, then it would not see me. That decision saved my life. It ran past me, stopping in the same place where I stopped. I didn't notice before I hid, but that spot is just under an opening in the trees. A pillar of light penetrated the oppressive dark, and, in the moonlight, I could see my assailant. It was pale, made paler by the white of the moon, and hairless. Thin, like it had not eaten in weeks. I want to say it looked humanoid, but comparing that thing to a human is just wrong. Its hunched back protruded out, making it look larger than any human. It stood on all fours in such a way that no human could. Its rear low to the ground, its long legs bent in such a grotesque fashion that it almost resembled a frog, ready to leap. It circled around, silently searching for me. I thought it was about to give up, but it threw its horrendous back upwards, and its legs straightened, and it stood, on two legs, like a person, a deformed, horrific human. And then it looked at me. It looked right at me. It saw me, I know it saw me. Nothing looks at you like that without seeing you. I could tell you the color of its damn eyes, and I bet you that it could tell you the color of mine. I clutched the rifle close to my chest. Too scared to use it, too scared to move. I closed my eyes and waiting for it to pounce, and then ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum. I opened my eyes and it was gone. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I fell asleep in that bush, cuddling with the rifle, until finally being awoken by the sounds of birds. Birds. Thank God, birds. It was already daylight. The next morning, I wearily stood up, using the rifle as a crutch to support my aching body. Things seemed to be normal. The forest was speaking once again, and birds and deer aplenty were in sight. I stumbles back to my camp to find my things mostly as I had left them. My tent was unsalvageable, but I took my backpack, had something to eat, and I left, just like I had planned. The entire trek back, I didn't stop looking around for that thing. I didn't let the gun leave my hands, either. It wasn't until I got to the car that I relaxed, calling my friend to tell him I was heading home. I didn't tell him about what had happened last night. I was still trying to process it myself. Shit, I don't think I understand wholly what had happened until after the car ride home. And that's where the story ends. 6 years ago, and I haven't gone camping since. I haven't seen the thing again, nor have I heard of anyone who's seen it. As a whole, my life has moved on completely. But I will never forget that thing. I will never forget how it stared at me, and how it just left. It knew I was there, but it left. Why did it do that? I don't think I'll ever get an answer. Second story. I encountered a Wendigo while making a remote border crossing. We've got crows back at home. In my town, we see them every day. Sometimes solo, sometimes in a group. I am well aware that a group of crows is referred to as a murder, but despite this ominous label, they're pretty shy and generally fly away at the first sign of danger. But the pair of big black birds circling the point across the lake were something else entirely. I know that around the Canadian border ravens become more common than crows, and this is what I suppose they were. But these were really big, too big, possibly bigger than an eagle. And as they circled the point, the calls they made were unnerving. Nothing like the caw of a crow. The sounds were screeching, drawn-out croaks, as though to make sure that every creature on the lake was aware of their presence. I kept quiet from my vantage point 200 yards across the bay, and the travelers I had in my charge knew enough to keep still and silent. We were 3/4 done with our journey that had begun at a clandestine location outside of Atikokan. I never thought I could become a smuggler, but here I was, tucked under ancient white pines with a man and woman who were essentially strangers to me. They watched the huge birds with me, whispering back and forth in their native language. I don't know what they were saying, but the look in their eyes showed their fear. And these people have seen things in their homeland bad enough for them to leave with nothing more than a few possessions, and then give all of their money to a stranger who arranged for me to take them through the wilderness to cross the most remote section of the largest unguarded border in the world. Traveling by canoe along a route that my ancestors have traveled since long before there was a border, we had crossed the imaginary line last night. And by this time tomorrow I planned to load them into a van that would be waiting at a trailhead near Ely. This was where we would part ways. For now we were preparing to break camp at a campsite known only to me. I carved it out of the timber a few years ago, and it is able to conceal not only a tent, but a canoe as well. There's not much canoe traffic this time of year, but I was doing a final check to make sure the coast was clear when the birds showed up. Figuring there must be something along the shore holding their interest, I fished my binoculars out of my pack to get a closer look at the sinister pair. To the naked eye, it looked like a typical rocky point on a shield lake. A smooth rock shoreline gave way to a stand of sparse bulrushes with a couple of boulders. One of the boulders didn't look right. I realized that I was actually looking at a dead moose that had floated up there, likely a casualty from the moose season that ended the week before. That explained why the pair of birds were circling, and I pulled the binoculars away to study how the birds were behaving. They took turns swooping down low over the moose and then soaring higher than the treetops and letting out their disturbing calls. Then there was movement in the trees. I pulled the binoculars back up and focused in on the mix of birch and fir that was along the shoreline. At first, I thought it was a bear coming down to take advantage of the dead moose. But this was far taller than a bear. Then I saw the antlers. Some smaller trees parted, and then what at first I thought was a moose stepped to the water's edge. I've seen hundreds of moose in my time up here, but what I was seeing now didn't make sense. Sure, it had antlers, and it was tall like a moose, but it was mostly without fur, and the color was all wrong, more of a sickly pinkish gray than the dark brown you would expect of a moose. I could see its ribs, and its front legs weren't really legs. They were more like long, gangly arms. Arms that ended in long, bony fingers. Even though I was about 200 yards away, I could see the glint of fangs. It stepped from the trees to the water's edge. It paused and looked up at the circling birds. It let out a scream that hung in the air. One of my travelers let out a whimper, and I turned, put a raised finger across my lips. I knew we were out of sight of what any typical animal or person could see, but this was far from typical. I flashed back to many years before when I stared wide-eyed at my grandfather as he told stories around the campfire. Flames flickered and birch logs crackled as he described an evil spirit called the Wendigo. Many generations ago, a lost hunter turned to cannibalism to survive, and his evil deed transformed him into a horrific beast. A beast that roamed the wilds with an insatiable hunger for flesh, human or otherwise. While this story terrified me as a child, I never gave it any thought as an adult, as the elders had many tales of spirits and such. But here I was, miles from the nearest road, two strangers in my care, looking at the impossible. I subconsciously reached to feel the outline of my revolver tucked into the back of my pants. The beast had now waded into the water, and its claws began tearing at the moose carcass. It ripped off huge chunks of flesh, hide, and bone with ease, shoving them into his gaping mouth where they were crunched and swallowed. The water around the moose carcass was soon tinged red with blood, and the pair of giant birds took roost in a tall pine above the beast. The carnage continued as the creature consumed impossible amounts in minutes. I heard one of the travelers whisper Monstoro. I didn't need translation to know what it meant. They had every reason to be scared now. I've had face-to-face standoffs with wild bears, with big city gangs, with angry fathers. At least with those you have an idea of what you are dealing with. My grandfather never said how one would deal with a Wendigo. With most of the moose consumed, the monster let out another scream. I was back to looking through binoculars, which was a mistake as the beast's face and chest were covered in blood, and flesh clung to its claws. An image I will never be able to erase. Despite having consumed the better part of an adult moose, it was still gone in appearance. It took a last look around, and I stopped breathing when its gaze seemed to focus on our location for a moment. It slowly turned towards shore and then disappeared into the brush. This cued the black birds to come down for what was left. One bird rested on the moose's hindquarter and picked away at intestines. The other rested on the head and feasted on the eyes and torn open neck. After a few minutes, they flew up silently, circled over our location, and then headed in the general direction the Wendigo had gone. At least they went in the opposite direction we were headed. We sat in silence for a time, then I pulled out a map. I showed the travelers where we were, where the Wendigo had gone, and where we needed to go to complete the journey. I showed them my gun, which I had kept hidden from them until now, hoping it would ease their fears. It didn't do much to ease my fears. It was a .357 revolver, enough to stop a bear, but what would it do to a Wendigo? I suspected there needed to be some version of a silver bullet to stop an evil spirit. I gestured to them to pack their belongings, which they did quickly and quietly. I calculated that if we traveled lightly and quickly, we could be out by nightfall. I decided to leave the tent and everything else not essential. We slid the canoe down the bank, climbed in, and pushed off. The woman sat on the floor in the middle. The man was at the bow. I paddled from the stern with intensity. We had about 10 miles to the end of the lake. At the end of the lake was a portage trail of about a half-mile that would bring us to the next lake. We had done a number of portages already on this trip, and after the morning's events I was dreading having to be on foot. There was no other way out. A light wind was at our back, allowing for relatively quick travel. The man was paddling as best he could, but it was marginally helpful at best. The woman kept her head down and did not move. Usually on this kind of trip I try to hug the shoreline to keep a low profile, but now we were tracking right down the middle of the lake. I was making a beeline for a height of land where I knew the portage was, and we continued along in silence. The paddle down the long lake was uneventful, and it was early afternoon when we reached the portage. Once ashore, we took a short break and ate some jerky, and then it was time to make the portage. It would be easier now since I had abandoned most of the gear. On earlier portages, I had the travelers hide out while I scouted ahead to make sure we would not meet anyone on the trail, but there was no time for that. I think they understood me as I tried to explain the importance of moving quickly and quietly. I pointed to the trail and then to the packs and paddles. They took the cue, and I put the canoe up on my shoulders, and we plodded along through the forest. It took less than an hour to get to the next lake. There was a forest fire here several years before, and the charred remains of a few old-growth pine stood in stark contrast to the young aspen, birch, and spruce that had grown in the void left by the fire. This lake was smaller, with many bays and points, and we were soon back to making progress in the canoe. 25, we came around a point midway down the lake. I looked to the end of the lake where we would find the next portage and stopped padding. Maybe 300 yards away was the remains of a burnt pine. Roosting in the tree were 2 birds. Big, black birds. The man in the bow saw them too, and muttered something to the woman. She looked up for the first time and stifled a scream. We had to go past them to get to the next portage, so I kept paddling down the middle, not taking my eyes off the birds. As we got closer, it was obvious they were watching us too, their heads pivoting as we passed them. I kept looking back over my shoulder at them, but they held their position. I didn't know what the presence of the birds on our route signified, but based on what I saw this morning, it couldn't be good. By the time we were at the end of lake where the next portage was, I could barely make out the tree anymore. I thought that perhaps we were in the clear, but then we all heard the unmistakable sound, the same sound we heard the birds making this morning. Even though they had to be over a mile away, there was no mistaking it. The long, drawn-out croaking continued for a minute, then it was silent again. I paddled towards shore so hard that the bow slid 2 feet onto the bank. "Go, go, go," I yelled. The travelers seemed shocked at my yelling, as I had not said anything to them in the few days we had been together that wasn't a whisper. They both scrambled out of the canoe, grabbed the gear, and headed up the path. I again wrestled the canoe onto my shoulders and followed. We still had another lake to cross after this portage. Then it was down a creek to where we were to be picked up in a remote parking lot at the end of a forest road. We would be early, but maybe I could get a cell phone signal and get a call or text to the driver. Or maybe we could hitch a ride with a tourist. Any concerns of being intercepted by authorities has now taken a back seat to getting out of here and away from that thing that for all I knew was making its way south toward us. Since we were closer to an access point, this mile-long portage was well traveled and we made good time. The first half was up a slight incline, Then it went down much more steeply to the next lake. We reached the top and paused for a quick rest. I set the canoe down to catch my breath. The crest of the trail allowed a good view of the valley ahead. It also allowed a good view of two huge, black birds that were circling above the treetops. The woman was not able to stifle her scream this time, and this prompted the birds to start up with their ominous calls. In the distance we heard another sound. It was a scream that could have only come from the horror we had seen this morning. While I felt a certain amount of responsibility to the travelers, my concern for them was waning. "You better keep up," I yelled as hoisted the canoe back onto my shoulders. I headed down the steep trail as fast as I could, and I could hear the travelers behind me, stumbling, but not falling too far behind. With the canoe on my shoulders, I couldn't see if they were carrying the paddles. Didn't matter. I keep a spare strap to the supports in the canoe. The steep path made a switchback and was able to see that the man was indeed carrying a paddle and pack. The woman was crying hysterically, carrying nothing. The path here was steep and rough, with many large rocks and roots creating potential tripping hazards. The birds were circling overhead us now, their croaks echoing off the hillside. We heard the distant scream again, although this time it didn't sound so distant. It was not possible for us to move any faster, but I took care to be sure-footed. I could see we were nearly to the bottom of the hill. Once there, it would be level ground to the next lake, which was now only a few hundred yards away. I made it to the bottom of the hill where the well-worn path went through a series of large roots and then turned to dirt. Once to the dirt, I flipped the canoe off my shoulders and let it land on the hull. The travelers were coming up 50 yards behind me. I grabbed the bow of the canoe and started dragging it, hoping the man would catch up and grab the stern. I started to yell at the couple to hurry, but I was interrupted by another scream from the beast. It was coming from our right, and I could now hear branches breaking and what sounded like breathing and snarling. There was no reason to think that the lake would offer refuge from this thing, but it seemed like a better option than facing it here on the path. The man was almost caught up to me, but he stopped to see where his partner was. She had tripped on a root and was now screaming, not sure if it was in pain or terror. Probably more terror, as the Wendigo had broken through the brush along the trail and was now 50 feet behind her. She looked back at it and let out what she meant to be a scream, but came out as a yelp. The beast was on her in seconds, and it picked her up over its head and slammed her to the ground. The man dropped to his knees, watching in horror as his partner was torn apart and devoured. Wendy 8, I resumed dragging the canoe as fast as I could, not looking back. The beast let out another shriek. Then there was a scream that I presumed to be from the man. I tried not to think about the snapping and crunching sounds I could hear from behind me. The next lake was now in sight, and even though my entire body wanted to quit, I was now running. The shoreline was sandy and I ran right into the water, allowing the canoe to float past me. I hopped in when the back seat was even with me, and in one motion pulled the tag end of the knot that held my spare paddle in place. A few quick strokes and I was 20 yards from shore. The screams of the beast continued, and the black birds that had been watching the bloodbath from treetops now were starting to swoop around me, getting closer with each pass. The Wendigo was now on the shoreline, and it let out the loudest scream of all. It stepped in the water to its knees but stopped, gesturing with its long arms and howling at the sky. Not knowing what to do next, I pulled out my revolver. At the end of this lake was the outlet stream that would lead me to a bridge. For the moment, I felt safer where I was. The birds were getting ever bolder, and I could feel the wind as one of them swooped in on me from behind my shoulder. It wheeled around over the bow and came right back at me. It reared back at arm's length with its wings spread and its talons coming right at my face. Taking advantage of a perfect opportunity, one pointed the gun barrel at the bird's center and pulled the trigger. Black feathers flew, and the now silenced bird landed in the water and strangely sank out of sight. The other bird flew up high and then quickly descended, coming right at me. I had the gun raised, but the bird did not offer a good target, and it flew past my head. Sensing weakness, it circled around and attacked, pecking me on the back of the head with its massive beak. I had to be careful not to tip as I tried to fend it off with the paddle. More determined than ever, the bird came back at me. I fired twice, missing both times. With 3 rounds left in the gun, I knew I better choose my next shots carefully. The bird came from behind me again. This time it wheeled around quickly, planting its talons on my chest and pecking at my eyes. My attempts to fend it off with a fist were not successful, and it got a hold of my eyebrow. I could feel flesh pulling away from my skull, and I pointed the gun right at it, and even though I thought the barrel was pressed right into it, I still missed. I resorted to using the gun as a bludgeon that I slammed into its neck. This had a noticeable effect. It let out a deep croak and let go its grip. I was not watching the Wendigo at this point, focused on the dark feathered assailant. I could hear it, though, as it let out shrieks and screams louder than a siren. The remaining black bird, shook up some from the pistol whipping, flew in a crooked path now, obviously having difficulty maintaining its course. I felt confident I could take it down with one of my remaining rounds. It came straight at me. I let it peck the top of my head as it went by. It circled around again, and once more I let it get me with a good peck to my temple. It made another loop around, and I was ready when it followed the same path of attack. It came right at me, and I was looking down the barrel right at the bird's head when I pulled the trigger. The raven's head disintegrated in a cloud of black feathers and blood, and the headless body landed at my feet, wings still flapping, talons still grasping. The shrieks of the Wendigo suddenly stopped. It stood motionless, staring out at the lake, not necessarily at me. I set the gun on the seat next to me. There was still 1 round left. I used the paddle as a shovel to lift the dead bird over the side and into the lake, where it too strangely sank out of sight. The Wendigo, while still a fearsome-looking beast with its face and claws covered in blood and flesh, had lost its menacing posture. I pointed the revolver at it, right at its head. I was confident I could hit it, not confident that my 1 remaining bullet would kill it. For some reason I thought about the old saying that if carrying a handgun for bear protection, you should save the last round for yourself. Pretty sure the old saying applies here. I lowered the gun and watched the beast. With its long bony arms hanging at its sides, it turned towards shore, and with 2 big steps it was crashing through the timber, heading away from the lake, away from me, away from my exit point. I sat quietly for a minute, trying to take all of this in. I could no longer hear the sounds of branches breaking. Was the Wendigo gone? Apparently they can't or won't swim. The ravens must act as seers or scouts for the Wendigo. Once they were eliminated, it was like a switch was flipped. I thought about the hapless travelers. I knew it was pointless to go back to where I had last seen them. What would happen to me when I left the lake? It was now late in the afternoon. I slid the revolver with its 1 bullet into the back of my jeans, picked up the paddle, and headed for the outlet creek. 3rd story. Whistler or Wendigo in Georgia. Asterisk, first post ever on Reddit. Been holding on to this story for a while, and after finding this sub, I felt you guys would be interested or have some input on what I could have seen. It's been almost 2 years, and I still can't get it out of my head. That whistle. Growing up in the mountains of North Georgia, camping and hiking were things me and my brother did so often it was second nature. So anytime Ryan and I had a break from school, we would head straight for the woods. We packed our gear, let our parents know where we were going, and that was that. No questions asked. We decided to camp about midways through Jack's River Trail in the Cayuga Wilderness, and it's a trail we knew fairly well as we had used to a few times before to practice long hikes. We arrived at the trailhead around lunchtime, parked the car, got our gear out, and headed into the woods. We passed a few hikers as moved along and asked them how the trail looked, and the answer was always the same: wet. Jack's River Trail probably crossed the river 50 times as it went along its 17-mile-plus journey, and with the colder temperatures of late fall settling in, it was harder for the trail to stay dry. We moved deeper into the trail and started to look for a place to make camp. This is where Ryan and I made our first mistake. You see, Ryan and I have this rule: we don't camp near people if at all possible. Call us paranoid, but the last thing we want is for someone to drag us out of our tents and into the woods never to be seen again. So we always camped a pretty decent ways off of the trail and in the area that wasn't popular with overnight camping. Roughly 2.5 hours or so, we found what we thought was the perfect place to set up for the 2 nights that we would be out. We came up to Horseshoe Bend and ventured about half a mile off the trail into a clearing and set up. We built a teepee fire lay for that night and pitched our tents on either side. After setting up and unloading, we decided to walk back to the trail and go exploring around some of many swimming holes Jack's River had to offer. This was during Thanksgiving break, and I remember being surprised at how few people were on the trail. Maybe it was the weather or the fact that this was early in the week, but there didn't seem to be anyone hiking, much less staying the night. Around 5 o'clock, Ryan and I headed back to camp to start our fire, make dinner, and settle in for the night. As soon as the sun began to set, the cold rushed in. We added more wood to the fire, sat close, and just enjoyed conversation. Ryan was 2 years behind me in school. I was a senior and he was a sophomore, but growing up we had always been close. We always hung out in the same groups, played the same sports, had the same hobbies, etc. Around 9, we were settled comfortably around the fire. I had just texted our mom to let her know we were safe and getting ready for bed, and I remember we were talking about dreading going to our grandparents' house for Thanksgiving and having the same awkward conversations we had each year with family we only saw on holidays when things started to get strange. We were no stranger to sounds in the woods, and these woods were full of animals, from deer to black bears and even the random wild boar. If you were in the woods enough, you learned to distinguish certain sounds, and what we were hearing I can only chalk up to as odd. What Ryan and I heard was what sounded like someone sneaking around slowly just out of eyesight. With an animal walking on 4 legs, you hear a tighter group of steps, but what we were hearing sound very distinct to what a human sounds like when walking slowly or trying to move without making much sound. I remember we both pulled out our flashlights and shone it in the direction we felt the sounds were coming from, but that is what was so weird. Whenever we would fix our lights on a spot we thought the sound were coming from, the location of the sound would suddenly change. It was as if there were multiple people walking around us. That's when the whistling started. At first, I thought it was the wind, and I remember thinking maybe the wind is just throwing leaves around, and what we are hearing is nothing but the wilderness around us. Ryan looked at me and asked if I was hearing that. I didn't answer and was trying to focus hard on each individual sound. 2 consecutive notes with roughly a 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes. Over and over again. Ryan kept asking if I heard that, and I put my finger to my lips trying to keep him from talking. The fear I felt was incredible. My jaw was tight, my fist clenched, knowing I wasn't ready for whatever was out there, if it was anything at all. The whistling continued for what felt like forever, but thinking it through was maybe 5 minutes when Ryan finally yelled out into the darkness, "Hey, quiet." The whistling stopped. The crunching of the wood stopped. Nothing. I was pissed. I looked at Ryan with a "what the hell" look, and he shrugged his shoulders. "I had to do something," he said. I just shook my head. We sat there in silence for a few minutes when the woods erupted with noise. Something or someone was running in a circle around our campsite. The whistling came back. 2 consecutive notes with the same 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes. How could someone whistle this loudly without cracking while also running? I was done. I stood up shining my flashlight in all directions trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was screwing with us. Nothing. It felt close enough to touch, but we never saw a thing. That's when the movement stopped, but the whistling was still constant. It was so loud. Inhumanly loud. I looked at Ryan and told him to call the police. Now this is the part one will never forget. The part one never liked to talk about. While Ryan was on the phone with the dispatcher and telling them our location and what was going on, I stepped around the fire towards my tent. Inside my bag, I had a 6-inch fixed blade that I always carried and thought I would feel a bit more comfortable with it in my hand more than just my flashlight. As I went to unzip my tent, trying to keep my eyes toward the woods. I heard some movement directly in front of me. I swept my light up in front of me, and for maybe 2 seconds I saw it. Whatever this person or thing was, it was about 5 feet up in a tree. Everything about it was long. Its arms, legs, neck, fingers, everything. And it was fast. As soon as the light hit, it launched backwards off of the tree. I heard it land, but it either jumped an impossible distance or landed in a thicket because I heard it but never saw. I don't think I have ever yelled so loud. I ran back to where Ryan was and sat down. He kept asking me what I saw, but I couldn't answer. I just kept thinking about what I saw. Maybe 10 minutes later, we saw a couple of flashlight beams coming through the woods, and about 3 guys came into view asking if everything was okay. I settled a bit and started asking them if they had seen or heard anything. All they said was they heard a lot of movement and then heard my scream, and that's when they headed in our direction. I tried to explain what had happened without sounding crazy, but it didn't seem to work. One of the guys walked around a bit and came back and said he didn't see anything. Ryan told them that we called the police, and roughly 30 minutes later a park ranger showed up. Ryan and I tried explaining everything to him, but he just chalked it up to either a curious animal or some campers trying to mess with us. Either way, Ryan and I decided we weren't staying the night. We packed our stuff up and walked out of the woods with the ranger. He took our statement, and we got in our car and drove home. Ryan and I don't talk about what happened that night, but neither of us have been back to Jack's River Trail and will probably never go back. 4th story. My encounter with the Wendigo. Let me start you off with some backstory. I'm a teenager who's really into this stuff, and I've done some pretty stupid things to get good results. But let me tell you, this was completely unplanned. I'm around 40% Native American, and my grandpa visits a lot of reservations. I know a lot about skinwalkers, which are my biggest fear. About 2 years ago, me and my sister were watching YouTube, and some pretty weird shit happened. I can elaborate on another post if wanted, and that's when I got a poltergeist at my house. Anyway, this happened at my Gram's, not the native side. She lives next to this really weird cabin we used to find huge skeletons of deer everywhere. Her house is pretty standard, small 1-story with a basement and lots of wooded area. When I was 13, I was staying with my grandma. Now her house is fucked. It feels heavy the second you walk in. The air seems to cling to your lungs, and the entire place feels off. On this day, I had come alone, and my gram wasn't ready for visitors. She was getting ready to go to the store, which I didn't mind, but I didn't want to be alone, so I decided to take a shower. About a minute after she left, I went to the bathroom and got changed. Then I froze. I felt someone watching me, which I knew couldn't be possible because, 1, no bodies out here, and 2, even though her house was 1-story, it was elevated. The windows were around 7-inch off the ground. My grandma did this thing where she always left the window in the bathroom open, so I had a clear view of what was happening. Not only that, but I could hear everything. I started to panic because I was way too far from any doors and none of them were locked. Plus, the bathroom door couldn't be locked. I stood still facing away from the window when I heard this bone-chilling, gut-wrenching, heart-breaking woman scream. It was coming from the woods near the cabin. Less than a minute later, I heard weird, almost clicky chirping noises. I hurried and closed the window. Big mistake. My heart sank when the window let out the loudest creak I'd ever heard. Maybe 20 seconds after I closed the window, I heard rapid footsteps right under the window. I whimpered as I saw what could only be described as a huge, blurry deer. The next day I found footprints. They were three-toed and massive. I didn't go over there for a while after that, but me and my friend are planning on playing the Ouija by the cabin. I'll be sure to let you know how that goes. Fifth story. Don't ever camp at MT Magazine in Arkansas. This might be a bit jumbled, so I'm sorry. I'm just trying to make sense of it all. Arkansas is the natural state for a reason. There's nothing but forests, mountains, and more forests. My favorite place in this entire world is Magazine Mountain, located at a very convenient 45-minute drive east of me in the middle of nowhere. I had my first date with my ex-fiancée there. We visited it quite often. We split up for the stupidest of reasons. She claimed to not want to, and I still believe it. I visited the mountain that same day, only to find myself back in my hometown emergency room after being found unconscious and dying in a field in a neighboring town. Many months passed by. I found myself spiritually. I ended up in a career path that I wanted, removed toxic friends, etc. Things were looking up for me. One day I decided to visit a New Age shop. I walked in, and it was as if time stopped. The shop owner, a white witch, spoke to me and gave me an amulet to wear around my neck. Nearly 1 week later, I woke up in a cold sweat suddenly. Something told me to go to MT Magazine. I checked my work schedule for the week, and I had 2 days off in a row, luckily. I took advantage of it and packed my things for my hike. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I couldn't shake the feeling despite the voice in the back of my head telling me not to go. I didn't tell anyone except my mother where I was going. As soon as I left work, I went home, got my bags, my German Shepherd, and left for the next 2 nights. We got to the mountain. It was a beautiful drive as always, but it seemed to take longer than usual despite my bad habit of speeding. There were deer everywhere. I nearly hit one about 3 times once we entered the Ozark Forest. About halfway up the mountain, I was brought to a stop because of a huge vulture in the road. I didn't want to hit him, so I stopped, but he just wouldn't budge. It was strange because there was no roadkill in sight. Being a taxidermist, any time I see a vulture, I look for the animal corpse it's feeding on. I can't explain it. It just always interests me. After about 2 minutes of the bird not budging, I decided to move around him, continuing up the mountain. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I had once I had entered the forest, but I continued. Once I reached the top, I visited several of my favorite spots, and while wandering, I stumbled upon a new area near one of the cliff edges. The sight up on MT Magazine is something that is unmatched. However, there was nobody in sight, aside from the employees at the lodge. Not only that, but it was silent. No bugs, no birds, not even an echo from my voice. It was extremely unnerving. I headed to the lodge and ate at their restaurant. It was pretty good, but not the best. Once I left the restaurant, I grew extremely drowsy, which was strange because it was only 7 p.m., and I usually stay up until 1 a.m. most nights. I ended up falling asleep on the floor in some day room on the 2nd floor of the lodge. I woke up to my phone going off. My mom was blowing up my phone. "What's going on? Text me back right now. You're scaring the shit out of me." I was more pissed than concerned. My mother knew there's very limited service on the mountain, and I called her before I left. I replied angrily, "There's no service up here. I'll be home tomorrow evening." I decided to head to my car and sleep in there since I wasn't renting a room. I was homeless for a few weeks, so sleeping in my car wasn't too uncomfortable for me. It was about 9:12 p.m. when I got to my car. It didn't take too long to fall back to sleep, but I remember, right before I slipped into unconsciousness, I could hear someone outside my car window screaming. I had very vivid, terrifying dreams, or what I hope were dreams. I remember one being me standing in the middle of the road on the mountain. There was a spotlight behind me, and there were eyes everywhere. Strange creatures watching me stand there, but there was one creature in particular several yards in front of me. It didn't have much of a defined shape, but I can compare it to a large deer. Whatever it was surrounded by crows. I've read up on creatures such as the Wendigo, skinwalkers, etc., but it was nothing like them. It seemed friendly, as if it was trying to show me something. I did not feel threatened, only frightened because of confusion. The crows did not scare me. Being a Cherokee Native American, I know that my totem animal is a crow. The large creature walked towards me after what felt like an eternity. It reached out towards me. In that instant, there was a bright blue flashing. I opened my eyes and I was in a different parking lot. There were blue lights flashing in my rear-view mirror. What the fuck? I said to myself, only to be followed by a tapping on my window. Ma'am, have you had anything to drink tonight? It took me a moment to realize what was going on, but I replied as I reached for my information to give to him. No, sir. I'm just tired. I didn't know where I was, how I got there, but I had to think fast. It was about 1:15 a.m., and I couldn't let the officer know how confused I was. I couldn't risk anything on myself. Eventually, I learned that I was in a town neighboring my own. I was nearly an hour from where I fell asleep at, but still had no clue how I got there. The officer did a sobriety test, searched my car with my permission, then wrote me a citation for driving left of center, and I went on my way. I still have no idea how I got home, what the dream meant, or why I decided to go to the mountain. Honestly, though, that's the least of my concerns. When I woke up the next morning, I logged onto Facebook. My bio stated that I was in the military. There were pictures I don't ever remember sharing or even taking. This mountain incident happened last night, but according to my phone calendar, it was 6 weeks ago. I don't know what happened or what to do. 6 weeks have passed within one night. Please help. I keep seeing crows everywhere. They're trying to tell me something. Sixth story. If you hear a baby crying in the woods, don't follow it. Pictures included. Last Friday, I was driving on a windy back road in the mountains of rural Utah. I was around 10 miles from the nearest town when my engine died. I pulled out my phone to look at the map. There was no service, but I downloaded a map of the area just in case. I saw that, if I followed the road, it was a 10-mile walk that wound back and forth along some back roads. I didn't like that idea very much. I also saw that the town was actually only 2 miles away as the crow flies. In a direct line from me, I just have to climb a little bit to cut my journey down. I shot a look up the mountain, left a note on my car saying what I was doing, and set off through the brush. That part of Utah didn't have much underbrush, just some scraggly bushes and the occasional tree clinging to life in the dry soil. I was making good time, and soon had shut off my phone's light to rely on the moon, which was a bright pearl in the sky. When my eyes had adjusted, it was almost like walking around in the daytime. The valley extended for dozens of miles to my right, and the weather was only slightly chilly with the wind. That was when I heard a baby's cry, low on the wind. It was far off in the distance to my left, slightly higher up the slope. I paused, listening hard. It came again, unmistakably the pinched short cry of a newborn infant. I paused for a moment before heading in the direction of the call. There was no one around for miles, and now there's this kid? After a few minutes of walking, I stumbled across what had to have been a 100-year-old cemetery. There were no headstones, just rocks marking the spots where the people must have been buried. I couldn't hear any more crying. I took a short video walking around the cemetery, which you can see here. I put my phone away in my back pocket, listening hard for the kid. I figured it must have been an animal. I thought I'd heard that coyotes could mimic human cries. Then I turned to look at the moon, only now noticing had been ringed by thick dark clouds. Almost as if on cue, the clouds rushed forward. Over the course of 5 seconds, the cemetery went from lit up by moonlight to pitch blackness. The clouds must have been covering every star in the sky as well as the moon. The darkness was complete. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. It was so black that it seemed almost physical, enveloping and dulling each of my senses. Then the baby cried again from my left, loud and piercing. I jerked, caught my foot on a rock, and fell forward against one of the fences. The baby was shrieking loudly. It couldn't have been more than a few feet away, just on the other side of the fence. I pushed back, sticking my hand into my pocket, feeling for my phone to turn on a light. That's when the dry, papery fingers slid around the back of my throat. Nails dug into the skin, and I thought I heard a high, raspy giggle from behind me just before they began to squeeze. I jerked forward, flipped on my light, and spun around. There was nothing there. I ran away, trying to put as much distance between myself and the cemetery as I could. When I finally reached the town, I put my hand up to my neck and felt the scrapes on my neck. I told myself it was just a tree, but I knew that wasn't true. I managed to get an old mechanic to come help me with my car. On the way back, I asked him a question about a cemetery up in the hills. He stiffened, looked at me, and said, "We don't go up there. We know better." 7th story. Something was watching me from the tree outside my 2nd-story window. I have the same routine at the end of every day. Shower, smoke a joint, scroll through Reddit, go to bed. After a long day at work, I got home and hopped in the shower. I work as an ER nurse in my city's local hospital, so by the time I get home, I'm basically sprinting to the bathroom to wash off the day's grime. It's a messy job. Not only physically, but it makes your mind a mess too. Working in the emergency department comes with seeing your fair share of traumatic things. To list a few, I've seen severe workplace injuries ranging from sawed-off fingers, crushed limbs, to someone being impaled on a metal pole. I've seen people who have been in car accidents and even a man who failed a suicide attempt with a shotgun. I suppose you could say I'm desensitized to things that would cause your average person to faint. I'm a tough woman, but what happened tonight has shaken me to my core, and I don't know what the fuck to do. I hope someone on here can give me some advice or insight. After my shower, I changed into my pajamas and pulled out the joint I rolled earlier. I don't smoke inside because I have animals, so I put my jacket on and headed out to the porch. I rent a 2-story house by myself on the outskirts of town, almost in the country. The closest neighbor I have is about half a mile away from me, so I don't worry about bothering anyone with the smell. It really feels good to be able to smoke after work and try to forget about some of the things I see on a daily basis. Today, the paramedics brought in a family who was in a horrible car accident. All 3 of them were pronounced dead on arrival. Their daughter was 5. I needed to smoke to get their faces out of my head, and with every puff, they started to fade. I finished up my joint and headed upstairs to my room, shutting off the lights and getting into bed. My German Shepherd, Rex, took his place next to me as usual. For about an hour I scrolled through Reddit, giving myself some entertainment before I had to go to bed to get enough sleep for work tomorrow. I was watching a video when I heard scratching on the tree just outside my window. I chalked it up to it most likely being a squirrel climbing the tree, which wasn't unusual at all considering there is a lot of wildlife around my house. A couple minutes later, I heard it again. Except this time, It was more like scraping instead of scratching. I started to get anxious, but I honestly thought it was just the fact that I was high and getting paranoid. I got off my phone and faced the other direction, snuggling up to Rex to try to get some sleep. You know that irrational thought you get where you start feeling super uneasy and it feels like someone's watching you? I started to feel that way. For 20 minutes I laid in bed with my back facing the window and could not shake the feeling of eyes watching me. I probably wouldn't have felt this way if it weren't for the fact that my window was open to get some cool air in my room. However, paranoid, anxious, and Jaime tried to ignore it. I almost fell asleep when I heard quiet scratching at my window. I started panicking and forced myself to get up to close the window and the curtains. Once I got to the window, I saw something. Not someone, something. I don't know how to describe it without sounding fucking insane, but there was something perched up in the tree branches outside my bedroom window. It looked like a naked man, but it wasn't a man. Its skin was white like a ghost, and the facial features weren't quite distinguishable. Its eyes looked so fucking hollow and empty. Its mouth was shut, but it almost looked like the skin was melted shut and rotting away. The thing was emaciated. Its face was sunken in. It genuinely looked like it was skin and bones. I have never screamed so loudly in my life. I slammed the window shut, locked it, and ripped the curtains shut. I ran across the room and hid behind my bed. Rex was growling at the window, just staring. I grabbed my phone over the bed and called the police, telling the woman that a man was in the tree watching me from my window. I had to tell them it was a man because I felt like they would think it was a prank call and not send anyone. 15 minutes later, an officer showed up and searched the property. They didn't find anyone, and the thing in the tree was gone. Since no one was there, the officer gave me a card with his number on it and told me to call if I see or hear anything suspicious. He left, and I hurried back inside. I'm terrified to look out my window. I can't fucking sleep. Rex is on edge. I have to be up for work in 4 hours, and I am wide awake in fear. I don't know what to do. I don't have a gun. I don't know many people. Seems I just moved here about 6 months ago, and work has taken up so much of my time that I don't have any left to socialize. I just peeked out the window, and I swear to God I saw something white crouched over in the tree line in the distance. I am losing my mind. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.